Hello and welcome to a special World This Week with me, Gavin Lee. Looking back at the world this year, 2024. And headlines have been dominated by wars in Ukraine, Sudan and the Middle East. Israel's leader has become a wanted man for alleged war crimes. And revolution in Syria leads to the downfall of a dictator. Though the true scale of Assad's reign of terror is still coming to light.
This one has been all dead.
Everybody here is dead.
Yeah, they were executed.
Sorry, is this a book of executions?
Yes.
It's been a record year for elections around the world. More than half the planet's population voted in more than 60 countries, with populism, polarisation, immigration, identity politics recurring themes. A tough year for incumbents, with compromises in India, South Africa, complete change in the UK, Senegal, Ghana, Portugal, Lithuania. While here in Paris, in an Olympic year, a baton passing of prime ministers worthy of the relay team itself. 4 of them too. Felt like a slow clap. And it's been a year where Americans made Donald Trump president again, and Time magazine made him Person of the Year again. And it's a year that's seen him convicted as a felon, survive an assassination attempt or two, and defeat 2 Democratic candidates in the race to the White House. One who didn't know when to stop, and the other who never seemed to get started. And then throw in the influencer of all influencers in the shape of the world's richest man, Elon Musk, adding technological might and reach, plus a curious daily game of who wants to be a millionaire. And you get Trump and the man behind the curtain.
Only reason we can now send American astronauts into space. Come here. Take over, Elon. Yes, take over.
Alongside me on the programme today, Vivian Waltz, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. Great to have you on the programme. Viv, an image, no easy question, but an image for you that sticks with you and sums up the year.
It's got to be the one of Trump emerging from his assassination, near death, actually. He missed it by an inch. But this really is the moment that turned around the US elections, and we will be feeling the results of that for years to come, no matter where we are in the world, particularly here in Europe, but of course across the US. Of course, countries from which migrants come from. I mean, in so many different ways, we will be feeling the return of Trump, and that is the moment in which he really returned. And even in history books, perhaps school children to come, perhaps that fight image of American presidents past, perhaps that will surely be there. To Richard Worley, perhaps in a similar theme, correspondent for the Swiss-German publication Blick. Richard, great to have you on the programme.
Thank you.
What's your choice?
Well, the symmetrical photo, it's Joe Biden lost in the Amazon. You remember this press conference that Joe Biden gave in Brazil? I mean, everybody, did not really understand. He was not completely out of his mind, but clearly, again, lost while Trump was in such a good shape. He had won the election. So I would say, poor Joe Biden. We have here the summary of a political tragedy.
I love it. It's Jungle Gym. It's I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. It speaks of civvies as well. Aishigul Sert, journalist and journalism professor at Sciences Po, the prestigious university here in Paris. Where are you taking us?
Mine is a tad different, but related. It's a picture from 2023, but it won a 2024 World Press Award. It's from Quebec, Canada, during the fires. And it's more the symbol than the picture. It's basically this firefighter on top of a rock looking around, and it's nothing but chaos and what remains. And although, of course, ecology, environment, and what our future and our children's future might be is kind of at the heart of this picture. For me, it's really the summary of this year with the wars going on, the conflicts, the economy, the uprisings, the presidents being down and up, dissolutions of assemblies, and And I feel like who's going to be the last man standing on top of the rock and looking for some hope. So looking at 2025 and trying to see something.
A man on the rock, kind of atlas inverted, and speaks not just of the politics, but also the natural disasters. You mentioned wildfires. We saw them in US, Brazil. We saw floods here, Valencia, over Europe, East Africa, earthquakes, Japan, Taiwan this year. So we need some hope. To Anne Bagger-Marie, seasoned independent journalist. Anne, great to have you with us. Where are you taking us?
Great to be here. Well, you're now tipping your hand and my hand too. I'm kind of a glass half full person, which often sits at odds with what I chose to do for a living. Because as you know, journalists are often described as the people who show up at the scene of a disaster and shoot the survivors. But I chose a picture that to me symbolized the moment during 2024 when the world, and we're going to discuss this poor troubled world that we lived in this year, the world stopped out for several weeks and just marveled at what Paris was able to do on its streets.
This is lovely.
Under its monuments. That's a New York Times photo. I wish I could remember the name of the photographer, but this was one of their pictures of the year. That's the view out my window, the Eiffel Tower. I'm lucky in that way. Look at that beautiful sunset. Look at those lights. Look at what they did in the Champ de Mars. They were able to build this beautiful viewing stand for beach volleyball. Paris pulled it off.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful parenthesis, as the French would say, between a beginning of the year that was dominated, as the end of the year was, by elections and turmoil and war and upheaval, including right here in France. For 2 weeks for the Olympics and 2 weeks for the Paralympics, the world just stopped and marveled at what human beings could do if they worked together.
It's a picture from Daniel Berahulak at the New York Times, out from your window with your view onto the volleyball pitch. OK, New Year's Day, January the 1st. Let's start at the beginning. And it began with bleak news from Ukraine. Russian drones and missiles attacking the country in an 18-hour bombardment that targeted energy facilities. It terrorized towns and cities. The government in Kyiv under pressure to defend front lines and continue the war effort lowered the conscription age in February from 27 to 25, while Moscow took more territory in the east, though at a cost of around 1,500 Russian troops dying each day, according to Western intelligence. $60 billion in US aid to Ukraine delayed for months because party politics ahead of elections, short of money, missiles. Cunning was key in August. A shock Ukrainian advance in the Russian territory of Kursk, now a negotiating chip for future peace talks, if they can hold on. Bear in mind, Putin secured his next term in office in spring, just weeks after the sudden suspicious death of rival Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny, who collapsed while walking, it was said, by Russia at Siberia's prison, the Polar Wolf. Meanwhile, President Zelensky's repeat request to use missiles of his allies to strike deep into Russian territory, eventually granted by the autumn, when it also emerged North Korean troops were now on the ground supporting Moscow, complicating the geopolitics and the risk of escalation.
Today, our insane neighbor has once again shown what they truly are and how they despise dignity, freedom, and human life itself, and how terrified they are, so terrified that they are already using new missiles.
Vivian, we're approaching the third winter now. How do you assess the year in Ukraine?
It is astonishing what the Ukrainians have withstood and what they have shown the world that they can withstand. I don't think any of us 3 years ago, as the troops were building up on the border of Ukraine, imagined that Ukraine could withstand a 3-year assault by one of the biggest militaries in the world. So I think no matter how dire the situation is in Ukraine, I think we have to remember that they have shown themselves to be just astonishing strategists, fighters, and patriots, almost beyond belief. Obviously, the economy in Ukraine is kind of dire. They're fighting a manpower shortage on the front line, which is not only very, difficult for the war effort, but also very difficult on the home front. Wages are going up because there's, companies can't find people to hire. The men are off fighting or they've been killed. The wives have left the country. So it's really going to take years, even if, as Trump says, he can pull off a peace deal. We'll see. It is going to take years to reconstruct both the country physically, psychologically, and just societally.
And as Vivian's talked about, Trump is a big factor in all of this, sorting out the war in 24 hours and how that would work, whether he's believed. And North Korea, I mentioned, adding this. What's your take on that complicated factor the North Koreans have brought?
I think, and nobody has a crystal ball on this, obviously, but the commentators who have studied this and that I've been reading really minimize the effect of North Korea in the overall scheme of what's going to happen to Ukraine. They really think that the critical factors are not how many North Korean soldiers are sent, because it's kind of a drop in the bucket if you think about the size of the Russian forces. Also, the North Korean soldiers are pretty poorly equipped and pretty poorly trained for the kind of terrain they're fighting on. Now, the big question going forward will be, what are the Western powers going to be willing to do? How are they willing to support Ukraine in its efforts to end this thing? But the fact that Putin was able to call on North Korea, a lot of commentators have pointed out, and I think with reason, that this is a sign of weakness, not strength.
A sign of weakness, Anne says. Richard, who do you think is in the driving seat ahead of peace talks, Vladimir Putin or Vladimir Zelensky?
Well, I think we should not underestimate Zelensky. At the moment, a lot of commentators consider that Trump will directly address Putin and that together they will strike a deal and Zelensky will have one way or another to accept the deal. I'm not so sure of that. I think Zelensky has still good cards in his hands. First of all, dignity. And I'm not sure the American people, even those who voted for Trump, are ready to accept that America sells Ukraine to Russia one way or another. So I hope, at least I hope, that a certain sense of dignity will prevail. And that's not in Trump's interest either, because keep in mind that Trump wants everything to bring money back to the US. What should bring money back in the US is a Ukraine that stands on its feet and need to buy weapons. It is sad to say, but that's the reality. So Trump will somewhat, I believe, try to freeze the conflict. He may manage to do that because everybody is exhausted on both sides of the front line, but he will certainly not at the moment completely abandon Zelensky. Now, the problem for Zelensky, because there is one problem, is that if the war quiet down, and I think we all wish for the war to quiet down and for the combat operation to go down, then he'll have to answer politically to his people, because he should have been standing for election this year, 2024, at the same time as Vladimir Putin. He did not. Election was postponed because of the war. The moment that a certain kind of peace will prevail, then the political infighting in Ukraine will start again, and that may be a bit messy for Zelensky.
Aishiko, so we have a risk of escalation. I mentioned North Korea. Then you have South Korean intelligence suggesting North Koreans accidentally shot, blue on blue in effect, Russian soldiers' communication language issues. South Korea, meanwhile, having its own domestic issues, impeachment of the president going through because of this martial law factor. So there is escalation issues, and while the world might be looking away, but both Zelensky, both Putin saying that they're not against peace. Zelensky saying it could come in 2025. What do you think?
If only it could even come in 2024 before New Year's, it would be wonderful. But the thing that has been very problematic for me to understand with the war in Ukraine is not only how Americans have been dealing with this, but it's how poorly, kind of what Anne Bagamari was hinting to, how poorly the Europeans have been dealing about the Ukraine situation. They, as much as Richard Verly mentioned the word dignity very correctly, and you mentioned, Viviane, the word of, in a way, resilience that Ukrainians have, the Europeans have lacked courage. They kept saying, yes, we are giving weapons, but you cannot use it on Russian soil. Yes, we will help you with ammunition and we'll help you with money, but you can. There was always a line that they kept doing. And I think the reason why we are actually entering the third year of the war is not because the Ukrainians have not been fighting. It's not because the Russians have not been fighting. It's because the Europeans, and led, of course, by the Americans in a way, have just been very slow and very, they lacked courage in the way that they went into war. If you're going to go into war, you have to go fully to it. And I think that's the reason why it's taking until, who knows, maybe 2025.
And it could be the critical year 2025. Aishikul, thank you. To the Middle East and demands on Israel throughout the year to increase desperately needed humanitarian aid in Gaza for Palestinians suffering, starving, trying to survive the life of airstrikes, continued displacement. In May, the UN's top court ordering the IDF to halt the military offensive in Rafah, supporting South Africa's application, calling for a number of measures, which is South Africa accusing Israel of committing genocide, which Israel denies, saying it acted proportionately to the threat in Gaza. Then in October, Israel closed in on the Hamas leader, architect of the October the 7th massacre, stumbling on Yahya Sinwar in an accidental patrol in Rafah, and they promptly sent in a drone. Of Sinwar. It was down to, well, ultimately to the Israeli Prime Minister reacting to the news that he had been the subject of an arrest warrant.
This is a black day in the history of nations. The International Court of Justice in The Hague, which was established to protect humanity, has today become the enemy of humanity.
I think, Richard, shall we start on that warrant for arrest, a wanted man? This is a kind of jaw-dropping moment, which, of course, he, as we just heard, denies any allegations, but still a moment where you stood and looked. Yes,
but Netanyahu is the winner of the year. If we may kind of nominate the winner of the year, he has clearly won. He has won on the battlefield in Gaza. You showed the images of Yahya Sinwar being killed. He is the winner now in the Middle East with what happened in Syria, and clearly Iran is not in position anymore to retaliate against Israel, while Hezbollah has been not decimated, but clearly downside and downgraded because of Israeli strike. So the problem we have here is we have a political leader who is under investigation for war crime and crime against humanity, but who politically has a lot of tools in his hand and is seeing his closest ally, Mr. Donald Trump, coming to the White House. So that's I think, something that we've never seen before. And I would believe that 2025, the political interest of the West and especially of the United States will prevail. And I doubt that Mr. Trump will somewhat distance himself from Netanyahu because of the International Criminal Court.
And we have another factor, Vivian, don't we? Because the right of the right wing of the government, Mr. Smotrich, talking about 2025 being the year for the annexation of the occupied West Bank, and also talk and reports of potential movements for settlers, according to the right wing of the government, again in Gaza. What's your take?
And let's not forget Trump's nominee for ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, is the man that said the West Bank doesn't exist. He is the ultimate kind of advocate for annexation of the West Bank. So politically, at least, Trump will find no opposition among his foreign policy team. Marco Rubio as well, strongly pro-Israel, the whole team of them, in fact. Elise Stefanik, the nominee for U.S. ambassador to the UN, effectively made her name by being vociferously against the Gaza protests in the U.S. So I just want to pick up one thing, though, that Richard said. Let's not forget that Biden really has been almost 100% behind Netanyahu. There has been almost no dissent. And it took many, many months before there was even that little bit. I think Antony Blinken has probably taken, 30 trips to the Middle East since October 7th, since the massacres of October 7th, and really come up totally empty-handed.
It's a very good point, and I want to raise that with Anne Bagamarie to what Vivian said. How do you think history will remember Joe Biden over this?
Over the Middle East?
Over Gaza.
Over Gaza. Well, Biden came in supposedly with great foreign policy chops, and I think you have to count that his failure to achieve his goals in the Middle East is one of the things that he will be remembered for as one of his biggest failures. Blinken is a skilled negotiator. It's a problem with Blinken now is that even though he has his fingers on the pulse and he knows all the players, and I think he's approached this with great strategic acumen, he has no power anymore. I mean, just as an example, the Israeli defense minister just recently said in a social media post that Israel, quote, will assume security control in Gaza. And Blinken came back and said, well, it's really more in Israel's interest to get out of Gaza because the alternative is Israeli occupation of Gaza, which the United States will not countenance. Blinken's in power for another 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So I think I think really one of the key factors then in settling this morass with Israel and Gaza is one of the factors is the regime change in the United States, and Trump may be looking for his Ronald Reagan moment.
His Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, maybe, but I mean Ronald Reagan after he was elected said to the Ayatollah, get those hostages out or I will rain death upon your cities. And guess what?
Happened within weeks.
It happened within weeks. I think it actually happened the day before the inauguration. They were in the air as he was taking the oath of office. I think Trump is looking for that moment.
A moment that appeals to the ego as well.
See, I want to bring it, the topic is Gaza and Palestine, and we've been talking about the U.S. I do understand that the U.S. and Israel have it goes hand in hand, and it's a big decision-making. It's what the U.S. decides. It's what Israel more or less will do in terms of money, in terms of giving the green light, etc. But I want to come back for this topic to les Gazaouis, to the Palestinians who've been on the side, you're showing right now images of destruction, of basically people who have been internally and externally killed, exterminated, displaced. We are looking at, it doesn't matter if Netanyahu politically in 2024, 2025 is the man who has a victory. When you see these images, there is no victory for Netanyahu. You were talking about history. History will remember this. It doesn't matter for how long is Donald Trump going to be in the office. For 4 years. Whoever is going to be in the White House is always going to be close to Israel because that's always the link. But I think that the Palestinians in the past year, this year, have been showing a lot of humanity, a lot of resilience, words we've been using for Ukrainians that I think we should be using for Palestinians, but also we are journalists. The Palestinian journalists, it's thanks to them who are on the side that we are able to see these images, that we are able to relay something. Because guess what? We are not allowed to go today to Gaza. Why? Because Israel does not want us to go. So there is a lot to be said also about despite the fact that there's destruction that they're losing, it's not the politicians, it's the civilians, because we will not forget what Palestine is going through right now.
Yeah, those are images of the year. And you talk about journalists, persona non grata, so too Antonio Guterres at the UN. You have the whole future of what happens to UNRWA after Israel stopped them essentially working in Gaza as well. So big months to come ahead. Well, let's take the pulse of what's been going on this year in Europe to June the 10th. 27 countries voted in the EU elections, 450 million people eligible for votes to the European Parliament representative. Support for nationalist, anti-immigration parties rose across the continent, especially here in France, with victory for the far-right National Assembly. Within an hour of the result, President Macron, clearly shocked, called snap elections.
This is a serious and weighty decision. But above all, it is an act of trust, confidence in you, my dear compatriots, in the ability of the French people to make the just choice for themselves and for future generations.
No party able to get a majority, leaving a three-way split between the leftist bloc, the centre, the right-wing. Cue political chaos, albeit with a brief, feel-good summer, as Anne just said, Olympic breather.
En français, vous pouvez essayer?
Could you try?
Comment allez-vous? Bonjour. Oui, oui.
Et vive les Jeux Olympiques!
Vive les Jeux Olympiques.
Merci beaucoup, super.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, after the breather came these headlines. The Economist, which said the centre did not hold well. We've seen the comings and goings, Anne Bagamarie. Talk me through what you've made of 4 prime ministers in a year.
Well, there's a lot to be said about Emmanuel Macron and his leadership of France. There's a lot to be said about the decision he made to call that snap election. The failure to read the room, as you might say, is why we are where we are today. All I can say is, having spent some time looking at not only the snap election, but the results of the no confidence vote and what's been happening in the legislature now, is buckle up. Because Marine Le Pen, the head of the National Rally, has said that her goal is to bring down the presidency and that her tool to do it is to force votes of no confidence whenever she can. I have no reason to believe that she doesn't mean every word of it, and I have no reason to believe that the government of François Bayrou, which is going to try valiantly, I'm sure, to find a way out of France's economic and fiscal hole, is not going to fall at some point. Of course, she has a time clock on her back. She has a court decision coming up that might, a corruption trial that may not allow her to run for office for 5 years. Fine. That just means that all of that aggressiveness is going to be compacted into a much smaller time frame. But I think we're in for a very, very, very difficult couple of months, and I think that you lay that squarely at the feet of a leader who has never really had the pulse of the nation, and I would probably have to say, based on watching him, doesn't really care whether he does, and is surprised himself at this outcome.
I want to talk about Macron in the middle in a moment, because he really is in the middle of a lot of crisis and chaos, not just domestically, but Vivian, listening to Anne, can you remember a time where there was so much political jeopardy and crisis in France, even having to pass this emergency mini-budget just to keep the lights on?
I don't recall this in France. I mean, France has always felt relatively stable, even though, governments were used to, the prime ministers, coming and going. But the presidency has always been a kind of rock of stability. And it doesn't feel like that anymore. And it feels really unsettling. But I don't think it's about France. I think this is really about Europe. And I think what French voters, in my humble opinion, have not really grasped is the true crisis in the EU. The fiscal crisis, just the entire kind of stagnation of the way the EU is organized, the way European economies are organized. And Mario Draghi, in his report a few months ago, really delved into this. I think it's a brilliant document. I think everybody should read it. He takes the US as the counterpoint, and it's quite obvious.
Yeah.
You have no major tech companies arising here who stay in Europe. They all move to the US. There's no venture capital being raised here. There's no innovation here. And I think that meanwhile, people are kind of, going to the street and screaming and shouting about pensions and this and that. The problems are so much more fundamental.
It's very good point, actually. Mario Draghi's point is basically we're losing, if not lost, the tech race when it comes to the US, when it comes to China as well. Catch up quickly. Vivian said, Richard, not just France, Germany. We've seen the traffic light coalition come to a stop. Confidence vote there. What's going on?
Well, to me, the political crises in France and Germany are very different. because Germany has an election coming on 23rd of February, and except if the extreme right, the Alternative für Deutschland, win, but apparently it's not at all in a position to win and nobody wants to govern with this party, except of this scenario, Germany will have a coalition. Germany will have a coalition, a gross coalition made of the Conservative, the Social Democrat, and the Green, probably. And that coalition will be a working government, and then Germany will be able, let's say, to move forward. The problem in France is that the country is stuck. And it's going to be stuck until 2027, which is the next presidential election happening in the month of May. And to me, that's the problem. The real problem for France is that because of Emmanuel Macron decided to dissolve the National Assembly, though he had a majority, not an absolute majority, but he had at that time around 250 MPs amongst 577. He dissolved the assembly and he ended up his own camp having only 150. So he has suffered a political defeat. He has not accepted to draw the consequence from this political defeat. And because of the French presidential system, everything is now stuck in the Élysée Palace.
Aisha, as we march through the year, briefly I'm going to ask you about Macron again. I mentioned domestically issues. We've also got Franco-Afrique, the warning from more African countries, Senegal, Chad, say
Mali.
Troops are not welcome. Mali too. Yes,
but it's what Anne said is so right in the sense that, look, I arrived to France more or less right after the election, the first election of Emmanuel Macron, and I find that not only is he getting more and more lost with the public, where he doesn't understand what is going on truly in the French psyche, but he's also becoming more and more arrogant in the speeches that he's giving. He keeps putting the blame on the people. You can't find a job, it's probably your fault. You're not happy with the pension change, it's probably because you don't want to work and you're lazy. But you know what? When you look at the EU has problems, but France has really deep, deep problems. When you look at the school system, when you look at the medical system. So instead of Macron, who has been a huge, the Obama of Europe when he came, gave a lot of promises. But the thing is that he forgot along the way the people. And it's the reason why there's a far right rising. Not because only EU has problems. It's because these men, because mostly men, hey, Bayrou, Barnier, all these prime ministers that we've had in all these years, are men. Why don't you try?
Woman.
Elizabeth Borne.
3-to-1
ratio.
Oh, you know what? Richard Verlier, after all these decades, they're so lucky. They have 2 prime ministers women. Wow, what an incredible success. But you see what I mean?
Yes.
Why don't you try, especially with after the dissolution, what we had? It could have been a woman, but they didn't choose.
Which takes us on nicely to the woman that was nearly president in the US, because it's going to be very close, the analysts said, too close to call, the pollsters said, neck and neck, said the pundits. That wasn't how it played out at all. Results definitive, clear from early on. Kamala Harris literally just cancelled her plans on the night, went home, while Donald Trump, who only had, a year that he could make up, proved to be the comeback king.
The Fox News decision desk can now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States.
Look what happened. Is this crazy? But it's a political victory that our country has never seen before.
Well, while Time magazine made Donald Trump Person of the Year, the New European magazine opted for a different winner. They opted for Gisèle Bellico, also in Germany as well, featuring on the cover of, there's Donald Trump for Time magazine. We also see the New European, Gisèle Bellico, and let's see the cover of Vogue, Germany, which we will see the headline, I think. They're able to show it. It said, "No more shame." In a trial in which Gisèle Bellico decided to lift her anonymity to say, in her words, shift the shame onto the perpetrators. A trial that gripped the world this year. And this is a case that's only just reached verdicts, sentencing, 50 men all found guilty, all convicted, a case that is deeply, deeply disturbing. Tell me how it's affected you and your thoughts on the trial.
Whoa. First of all, good for the European magazine for celebrating the courage of this woman to not only take her case to the courts in France and trust them to do their job, but also to do it not under the veil of anonymity, to put a face and a name to everything that happened to her. There's no denying her courage. What unfortunately hits with me as I watched all of this and followed it closely is that we've been here before. Not in the terms of this particular case, which are horrific and never seen before, but in this idea that, okay, this is a moment that will change the way French men and women view each other, the way that French society views how women are treated, especially in the justice system. We've been here before. Me Too happened here as well. Dominique Strauss-Kahn and his boires et déboires, as you say in French, they predated Me Too. And every single time a man has abused power and been called upon it, and consequences were imminent for this kind of behavior, somehow or other France just swerved. It just didn't happen. In this case, the fact that justice was served, although there are legitimate questions about why only her husband, Dominique Pellicot, Gisèle Pellicot's husband, got the maximum sentence, and all of the other 49, 50 defendants got reduced sentences. There are serious questions about that. But I would love to think that this time it'll make a difference in the way men and women view each other in France. I hope that's the case. I'm not so sure.
Aishikul, do you think it will?
All I can say is amen to what Anne said, because that's exactly right. It's I've lived for a very long time in Turkey, but we will not even talk about women's rights out there. But about the U.S. and following how the U.S. and the women in the workforce, women in newsrooms, women with Me Too and the Weinstein story has been gaining more voice and liberty, and things have been changing actually. And when you take that in parallel with France, where we've had these kind of trials, even though this one I think is going to mark the history, is that the change in France in terms of women's rights, in terms of patriarchy, is even in the media, is coming, but very slowly. Hey, Richard Verly is a very open-minded journalist and man, but it's interesting that the example he very instinctively gave was right away, hold on, we had one woman, although we had 15 other men.
No, this year.
Doesn't matter, but it's one, you know what I mean? It's this change in this, though you're not French, you're Swiss, so you're higher standard, dear Richard. But it's a lot of subconscious, and it needs to change. Just one thing. A couple of weeks ago at Sciences Po, to give you an example, we had a meeting, and there was a gentleman who said, we should be very careful at the School of Journalism because we are having, in terms of percentages, more women than men. And you know what? Actually, that's a good sign, because since after the women only reached the newsrooms and they were able to sign their, 3 journalists are here. They were treated as secretaries in the newsrooms. So it's good that this balance is changing, because it's going to find another balance in a little time. So we need to give change some time. But in France, it's taking extra time to come.
I want to get brief thoughts before we go into Lebanon and Syria. It's both from you, Richard, and you, Vivienne. 2 thoughts. Wider repercussions, as Aishikul talked about, but also the apparent ease that Dominique Pellicot did this, the fact that he'd been told this from somebody else, and the fact that he got caught because it was another crime he'd been committing. What's your takeaway?
Look, there is nothing quite as powerful a story as an ordinary person doing truly extraordinary things. And here there was almost a perfect example of it. So in that sense, it really is a story that kind of took people's breath away. The other aspect of it, which is the one that you mentioned, is the complete banality of evil, to use the phrase, that this was a kind of middle class, upper middle class, even, small town situation, or the rapists were regular guys. And here you have a marriage that had lasted for 50 years. So I think that people are kind of reeling with how this could happen in plain sight for so long.
Richard, very briefly, your thought before
I want to pay tribute to the judicial system and to the trial, though I know there is a controversy about the sentence because they were not as harsh as asked by the prosecutor. But the trial went on for 4 months in that city of Avignon. The lawyers who defended the accused, they stood up, especially the lady who defended Dominique Pellicot. And in my own story, I also pay tribute to her, Beatrice Zavaro, because in such a context, it's very difficult to defend a rapist like Dominique Pellicot. She did, and I think we need to defend those accused as well. And that's important not to forget that.
Richard, thank you. Well, we'll return to the Middle East to talk about 10 key days that happened in September. A mass explosion of pagers in Lebanon that killed dozens as they detonated. And days later, Benjamin Netanyahu in New York, ostensibly to take part in peace talks at the UN. His office confirmed he'd given the green light from there, by phone, the green light to carry out an airstrike in Beirut that killed the longtime Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Afterwards, the Israeli Prime Minister flew back to Israel with this message for Hezbollah and its backer, Iran.
ולמשטר האייתולות אני אומר, מי שיכה בנו, אנחנו נכה בו. אין מקום באיראן או במזרח התיכון שהזרוע הארוכה של ישראל לא תגיע אליו.
So we get to a point where, well, November the 27th is a moment of truce with Lebanon and the IDF. And then that same day, 300 kilometres northeast of Beirut, a Syrian rebel offensive began from its stronghold in Idlib, a lightning advance on Damascus that rapidly brought about the end of the Assad regime, father, then son Bashar, who quickly escaped to Moscow for asylum. In the momentous events that followed, the Islamist rebel leaders pledged to be the government of salvation and called for sanctions to be lifted. The crimes of Assad are beyond comprehension, and they're still only just being discovered.
There are reports that the number of people buried here is much higher than 150,000. But either way, that is a sizable proportion of the entire number of Syrian people disappeared under Assad's regime. And I simply don't know what else to say, really, about this place. Except this. Here is the true size of this mass grave.
Difficult to watch, Anne, but at an end that we're talking about liberation at least, or we're talking about potential, some say, democracy. What's your reaction to where we are now?
Well, you're right. Those are difficult images to look at. Even for those of us who are great connoisseurs of the black and white footage from World War II, that's pretty horrific to see. Looking forward, because we don't really know exactly what happened to cause the rebels to have the success that they did, but one thing is clear from what's happened in Syria is that Syria is, for better or worse, no longer Russia's problem. And it's probably not going to be America's problem either, because Trump has already said it's not our problem. It's going to be a regional issue. And that means we're going to probably see more of Benjamin Netanyahu telling us what he wants to have happen there. We're going to see the Saudis. We're going to see Turkey.
Iran.
We're going to see the AUA. Iran is fighting on so many fronts. Indeed, they might want to get involved, but it's hard to see how they're going to have the bandwidth to do it. But this is now going to be a regional issue. And the question in my mind, watching the news coverage, is, again, how are the Western powers going to engage with this new government, which has already been touted in headlines and long analyses as, well, you know, they're not much better because they were related to ISIS and they were related to al-Qaeda. So we don't really know who these guys are. We just know they're not Assad. So
let me ask you briefly, in the 20 seconds or so that we have, all of you, is this a moment of hope that we're going to see into 2025, the fall of the Syrian regime and what it becomes?
Briefly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Vivian?
Yes, I think so.
Better than what came before, Richard?
Oh, yes, definitely. There is a chance.
A final thought, Aysegul.
After 54 years of dictatorship, absolutely.
It can't be much worse. Thank you all, Aysegul Sird, Richard Worley, Vivian Walt, Anne Bagger-Marie, all of you so much. It's been, well, a year where we can also end with a highlight that something happened this year right here in the City of Light. Back from the ashes, the reawakening of Notre Dame. We will see you in January for the world next year. Till then, thanks for watching.